Welcome to From Idea to Implementation, a Ranked Choice Voting and Voting Systems Symposium. The first session, RCV Today, will begin shortly. My name's Chris Hughes. I'm a staff attorney with FairVote and liaison with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. I will be your moderator for this session. First, a few housekeeping matters. Participants have been muted for this session to reduce audio. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist. If you have a question or comment regarding the webinar, please type that message in the question box. Session 1 will be about 45 minutes, followed by a brief question and answer period. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post along with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website within a couple of weeks of the symposium. Now, let's welcome Gary Bartlett, Director of the Resource Center, to give us an overview and introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Chris. Our two-day RCV Symposium is an accumulation of 2 years of research, dialogue, and introduction of procedures and technologies offering tested and new perspectives while learning from the past and preparing for the future. When we embarked on the idea of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, we knew that we could offer a unique perspective as election administrators, not as advocates. We have shared our experience with voting equipment vendors, policymakers, the public, and perhaps most importantly, fellow election administrators. Our website publications, webinars, and podcasts are a compilation of best practices and firsthand knowledge from jurisdictions that have used this voting method. This symposium will be another great resource to further understanding about administering and implementing RCV. The Resource Center continues to evolve, as does RCV. Both have gone from idea to implementation. We hope these resources and sessions help you and others improve our democracy and conduct of elections. We are excited that other experts in the election industry have recognized our contribution and are contributing to this symposium. This recognition has also been an evolving process. Several variations of this voting method has been around for many years. However, today, RCV is more viable than ever before, which has added to the increased interest. The wealth of knowledge from best practices and advances in technology and voting systems affirm RCV can actually be implemented rather than just a possibility or hypothetical idea. We have gathered folks who have seen this evolution take place and have helped shape the conversation. So without further ado, let's kick off this symposium by discussing how RCV has evolved, what issues this voting method addresses, and some initial lessons learned over the course of RCV elections. Our panelists for this session, entitled RCV Today, offer 3 unique perspectives. I am going to introduce them in the order they are presenting. Casey Carl became the city clerk of Minneapolis in June of 2010 after working in county government in Johnston County, Kansas for more than a decade. As city clerk, Casey has been involved in numerous aspects of city governance, but the key to his participation as a panelist today is that the city clerk's office conducts the elections for Minneapolis, including ranked choice voting. We also want to acknowledge that the initial idea for this symposium stemmed from an idea that Casey and his assistant clerk, Grace Wakalowitz, had, and we appreciate them for letting us run with it. Anita Earls is a civil rights attorney and founded the Southern Coalition of Social Justice. She is known for leadership in litigating successful challenges to North Carolina's changes in voting laws, gerrymandering of state and congressional districts. I know her well since she served on the State Board of Elections of North Carolina during my tenure as state elections director. Anita's remarks have been pre-recorded since she had a conflict with her schedule that required her to be in Washington, D.C. Rob Richie has been the executive director of FairVote since co-founding the organization in 1992. FairVote and Rob have played a key role in advancing, winning, and implementing electoral reforms, particularly ranked choice voting and fair representation at the local and state levels. Because the impact that Rob has had with election reform, he is a sought after resource for the media, professional organizations, and academia. Now that you've met our panelists, I will turn the program over to Casey.
Good morning. My name is Casey Carl. I have the privilege of serving as the clerk of the city of Minneapolis, and in that capacity, I serve as the chief elections official. I'm grateful to the Resource Center for convening this series on the practical aspects of ranked choice voting, as well as the chance to share a bit about our experiences here. My time is brief, so I'm going to push through my formal presentation as quickly as possible. This first slide provides a snapshot of the city of Minneapolis in 2017. Minneapolis is a city of the first class under the state's municipal classification system. Our municipal elections are conducted in the off year following the regular presidential election. The municipal ballot includes a total of 22 seats, since all of our offices are up for election at the same time. As you might imagine, this creates a long and rather complex ballot that features a mix of single-seat and multi-seat races as shown on this slide. This next slide shows that we've had 3 elections using RCV. The transition to RCV in Minneapolis began in late 2004, and it built over the course of 2005 through grassroots advocacy and community organizing. The proposed amendment to the city charter was referred to the electorate as a question as part of the 2006 general election, and it was adopted on a 2-to-1 margin. So in Minneapolis, the impetus for this transition was really driven by the community. Yes, there were policymakers who supported it, oftentimes vocally, but they acted more as shepherds of that process, and they really allowed the momentum for the transition to RCV to be driven by the community itself. Following adoption in 2006, an implementation task force was established. And that task force had 2 subcommittees. One was a technical advisory group that examined election systems to assess the potential for an automated solution for RCV. The second was a legislative rules advocacy group that addressed necessary changes in both state and local policies to successfully implement RCV without any legal conflict. Support for our task force was provided by FairVote Minnesota and its executive director, Jean Massey. Ms. Massey was instrumental in implementing ranked choice voting both in Minneapolis and our sister city, St. Paul, and most recently, in fact, just last week in the city of St. Louis Park, which is a first-ring suburb located just west of Minneapolis. Because no certified equipment was available when RCV was adopted in 2006 and implemented in 2009, the city developed what we called the Minneapolis method, and that provided a step-by-step policy guide and associated procedures for how to hand count and tabulate RCV ballots. The principles that underpinned that original method still govern our process today, and in fact, it formed the basis of our most recent election just last year. And this slide shows some key metrics from our 3 RCV elections. In 2009, there wasn't really a significant competition in any of the races on the ballot. It largely was incumbents standing for re-election. Even though we had only about a 20% turnout, it took us a full 15 days to complete tabulation before unofficial results could be announced. However, keep in mind that that was our first use of ranked choice voting, and we had committed in advance to a full hand count of all the ballots to ensure complete transparency. Between 2009 and 2013, though, several policy and process improvements were made to streamline tabulation, and our partners at Hennepin County also purchased a new voting system in 2013, and it featured an exportable data file, what's called a cast vote record, and that helped to expedite our tabulation processes, even though they still are not fully automated. That system was used in 2013 and 2017. These policy and process improvements, combined with new equipment, enabled us to complete all of our tabulation and declare winners on election night in 14 of the 22 races on the ballot in 2013. That's about 63% of the total ballot. And for the remaining races, it took us a total of 3 days to complete tabulation. Of those 3 days, 2 full 12-hour days were required just to tabulate our mayoral race, where we had a total of 35 candidates. In 2017, due to significant increase in the competitive nature of races up and down the ballot, in fact, all races, the city was able to declare unofficial winners in only 6 of all the 22 races on our ballot. And that's about 27% of the ballot, so a greater decrease in terms of the announcement on election night of results. But because of those policy and process improvements we made between 13 and 17, we were able to complete all of the tabulation in all races in less than 24 hours after our polls closed on election night. So that was a significant savings in time to produce results announced publicly. And in addition, I want to highlight on this slide the growing turnout over those 3 years that we've used RCV. So from 20% in our first use in 2009 to 42% just last year. That's a growth of more than 130% turnout over the course of 3 election cycles. In fact, the turnout that we had last year in 2017 is really on par with what we would expect to see in a midterm election based on our regular 4-year election cycle in Minneapolis. The next 3 slides I'm going to go through very quickly. They just show photos of the mayor and council members. It's intended to show how RCV has resulted in greater diversity in amongst our policymakers. So on this first slide, you can see the demographic profile of the mayor and council in 2009 with mostly white, older individuals. There was a fair balance amongst men and women. On the next slide, you see in 2013, there was greater diversity in terms of race and ethnicity. It was the first time Minneapolis had elected individuals of East African, Southeast Asian, and Latino descent. The age distribution also widened, with the youngest council member ever elected at that time was 28, and there continued to be an equal balance amongst men and women. On this slide, in 2017, the mayor and council diversity also continued to increase, both in terms of race, ethnicity, and age. In fact, we set a new record for the youngest elected council member last year when Jeremiah Ellison was elected at the age of 22. So our oldest council member is 62. That's a difference of 4 decades between them. The balance amongst men and women tips slightly in favor of men. There's fewer women, but we've also increased diversity in terms of other factors. We have 2 transgender council members. We have 2 Muslim members, 2 Jewish members. We have a greater diversity in terms of our professional experiences and backgrounds amongst our city's elected policymakers. This slide summarizes the policy and process improvements we've made based on lessons learned after each experience with RCV. I won't read these. They're very, I believe, fairly self-explanatory. What I would want to point out is that we feel confident we've refined our policy framework and operating procedures to the greatest degree possible. What we need most at this point is certified systems that fully automate RCV tabulation. And I know that's a primary concern of most of my colleagues as election administrators, that they share this concern at that point. But a key question in my mind in terms of full automation, of course, is the standardization amongst states and jurisdictions in terms of how calculations are processed and how RCV ballots are tabulated. We need consistency in our processes as election administrators across jurisdictions in order to push the industry forward. There's no motivation amongst the vending community to design and construct systems for one-off solutions or a jurisdiction-by-jurisdiction basis. So we have to reach consensus on a uniform policy and standards in that regard. This next slide visually depicts the major process improvements we've made between 2009 and 2013, when the most time-consuming and costly aspects of our manual procedure were eliminated, thanks in large part to the semi-automated process that uses an exportable data file given by our new equipment. As a result, we've achieved savings both in terms of our overall costs and our production timeline, but also in how we tabulate the RCV ballots in order to produce unofficial winners. And I want to point out that these improvements were absolutely critical in reducing tabulation from a 15-day period in 2009 to less than 24 hours in 2017. Now imagine what a fully automated system could do. This next slide summarizes turnout for municipal elections prior to RCV and since RCV in Minneapolis. As you can see, in 2017, we returned to voter turnout levels we haven't seen in about 20 years. And of course, across the nation, turnout in elections has been on a steady decline since the late 1970s. As election administrators, we know turnout is very complex. It's a highly nuanced issue. It has a lot of interconnected factors that can impact turnout. Research shows that competitive races are consistently about the #1 factor that drives turnout, and I generally believe that's true. But I would offer that competitive races used in combination with the ease of ballot access that RCV provides and the maximum flexibility that it gives voters in terms of expressing choice makes RCV a factor that needs to be considered, both in terms of its ability to drive engagement and, as a consequence, potentially actual turnout. In addition, I've seen firsthand how RCV changes the tenor and rhetoric of campaigning. Candidates in the last 2 municipal elections in 2013 and 2017 have been cognizant of the need to attract support from their competitors' bases. And so as a consequence, there's less of the traditional attack style campaigning, which could turn voters off or make them tune out. Instead, both of these elections featured more deliberate, focused discussion about policy platforms and priorities. There were actually more debates, oftentimes highly concentrated on very specific subjects, hosted by a wide range of advocacy groups across the community. And this no doubt resulted in some challenges in terms of campaigning tactics, because candidates and their teams were confronted with the need to distill very complex public policy issues into sound bites and to focus in a positive way on what differentiated them from other candidates. It's a difficult proposition at best, and it certainly doesn't grab headlines nearly as much as traditional negative campaigning tends to attract, but it certainly has been the tone in 2013 and 2017 with our RCV elections. The next slides I'm going to show are results data from our post-election surveys. We do this each year after an election using RCV. The trends across all 3 years show some statistics, a growing awareness of and support amongst our electorate for RCV, a greater and increasing use of ranking options across all races on the ballot, and support to continue using RCV in future elections. Despite these strong survey responses, the Minnesota legislature this year introduced a bill which, if passed, would eliminate the option for local governments to choose RCV in the future. This prohibition would even apply to jurisdictions where RCV was enacted by referendum and at voter preference, as in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So we're not completely certain about the future of ranked choice voting right now in Minnesota, but I believe in the end local control will probably carry the final decision. Of course, it's always concerning when local control is threatened or actually preempted, so we'll continue to monitor that situation as the legislature moves towards final adjournment next month. This final slide includes my contact information as well as a picture of our elections website and address. Our elections website has an entire section about ranked choice voting in Minneapolis. It includes historical files about the development RCV here, voter turnout maps, reports that include analyses of our experiences, our lessons learned, and access to our policies and administrative guidelines. I welcome contact, and with that, I've completed my prepared comments. Thank you.
I am really grateful for this opportunity, and thank you so much for the chance to talk a little bit about my experience with using alternative election systems, and from that perspective, the value of something like ranked choice voting, and in particular, how that impacts minority communities. My background is that for 30 years, I've been a voting rights attorney, most of that in the South, and really started out doing that work from a perspective of how can we make it possible for African American voters in the South. I'm in Durham, North Carolina, and most of my practice has been in North Carolina. How can we, so right after the Thornburg versus Jingles case in the Supreme Court, that opened the door to bringing claims on behalf of voters who previously had been excluded from the political process because of the way racially polarized voting operated in many jurisdictions in the South. And here we're talking about local jurisdictions, school boards, county commissions, city councils. There were many places in the South where African Americans had not been elected to those bodies, even though the Black population could be as much as 40% of a county. But if a county commission was elected at large and the voting was highly racially polarized, then candidates of choice of Black voters were just never able to win. So we brought lawsuits to try to change the method of election. And very early on, several communities were willing to have a change in the method of election, but they wanted to keep some features of being at large. So they liked the fact that everyone in the county could vote for everyone on the county commission. And so in several of my cases, we reached agreements whereby we would use what sometimes is called modified at-large systems, or semi-proportional systems, but we would use limited voting in North Carolina, and in places in Texas and Alabama, cumulative voting has been used. And that type of system has made it possible for African American candidates of choice to be elected, even though the voting is at large. And the other thing that I've now had the opportunity to witness over the past 3 decades, really 2.5, 3 decades, is that there are a number of really valuable consequences from using, say, limited voting. And the example that comes to mind for me most clearly is in Beaufort County, North Carolina, where the county commission is elected, 7-member county commission, 4 staggered seats, 4-year terms. So when 4 seats are up, every voter can, their votes are limited to 2, but they vote for any 2 of the candidates who are running. And then when 3 seats are up, every voter gets to vote for 1. And because the African American voters in Beaufort County are more than 25% of the population, they're always able to elect at least 1 representative when there's 3 seats, and at least 1, even easier, when there's 4 seats up. So they always have a representation on the county commission. Since this time, they've always had representation. It's meant that the county does not have to redraw districts every 10 years. It's meant that the candidate of choice can live anywhere in the county. So even though a geographically compact or concentrated community of Black voters may be in one part of the county, if their chosen candidate lives in a different part of the county, that can still be the person who runs and wins. So it really opens up the process at the local level in a number of important ways. So that then kind of sets the stage for understanding how ranked choice voting can be, in certain circumstances, a real solution to the problems of vote dilution. And you can look at vote dilution, not only is it not only could it be African American voting strength that's being diluted, but it also could be voting strength of some other type of minority, whether that's by political party or by a particular policy issue that a group of voters might share. So it really creates the opportunity for broader representation and a move away from single-member district systems. Certainly, it's important from my perspective to always be very cautious because I think at least 2 things have to accompany this kind of change in an election method. So first, there needs to be a public education effort. People need to understand how the voting system's going to change and what they need to do to be able to effectively vote their preferences. And from my experience, that's not hard. So with the limited voting, people at that time were used to hearing single shot voting, and so we could tell people this is basically allowing everyone to single shot vote. But I think with ranked choice voting, if you try to explain to people how the votes are counted, you can lose people. But if you just explain that all they have to do is rank their preferences, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, that's easy to understand. We all know about picking our favorites and ranking them that way. So it is important that people understand, and candidates, prospective candidates, that they understand how the voting process works. So that education effort is important. And then the second thing that's really important to pay attention to is not making false claims about the ability of these systems to empower minorities. And by false claims, all I mean is that you do have to, the minority population does have to be at a certain level, sometimes called the threshold of representation, but they have to be able to use the system effectively. And I am aware of some circumstances where lawsuits have been settled, putting in place one of the alternative election system where the minority population wasn't large enough to meet that threshold of representation, and so they weren't able to elect their candidates of choice under that new system. So you do have to pay attention to what the minority population percentages are, and especially if you're dealing with Latino populations where it'll be important to pay attention to citizen voting age population and not simply Latino voting, Latino population generally. But once you're clear that you have a system that can work in the particular circumstances of the community, and then secondly, where there's a commitment to making to having a public education effort when the new system is first used, that I've seen it work effectively for voters and for communities that otherwise would not have a voice in the system. I think one of the other things I would address is the issue of congressional districts. Like when you can't go completely to a at-large system. So in a state like North Carolina, it's simply too large to elect all of our congressional members at large. There's been an effort to really misinform people and to suggest that by using ranked choice voting, you would be harming rural voters, for example, or that you would be giving some voters more votes than others. And I say that's misleading because this is a state that in the past, and not all that distant past, in the mid-1980s, before the Jingles lawsuit, used multi-member districts for its state legislative districts. So we've in the past had a circumstance where some voters lived in single member districts and other voters lived in multi-member districts, and that as long as the one person one vote adjustments were done appropriately so that everyone's vote carried the same weight, that was seen as a perfectly fine system for electing our legislature. So dividing, if North Carolina has an odd number of members of Congress, say 13 members of Congress, and the state's divided into 3 multi-member districts, and so some of those districts would be larger than others because some would have more members of Congress. As long as every person's vote carries the same weight, I think we should be willing to consider that a fair system and be willing to recognize the value that it carries, because it is much harder to create a partisan political gerrymander in that kind of system. And North Carolina is a state where just earlier last year, a federal court found that congressional districts that were drawn in 2016 to remedy a racial gerrymander were in fact an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. And I think we don't yet know how the U.S. Supreme Court might rule in the partisan gerrymandering cases from Wisconsin and Maryland that are currently pending. And so the outcome of the North Carolina case will depend on those decisions. But we have had from Pennsylvania a final decision now that under the Pennsylvania state constitution, the way those legislative districts have been drawn were partisan gerrymanders under the state constitution. And a lot of states are wrestling with, well, how do we draw our districts in a way that is truly fair, that truly gives voice, an equal voice to all voters in the process? So some states are using commissions. States like Florida have made it unconstitutional to consider partisan data when drawing districts. And what I want to suggest to you is that all of this concern and problem of partisan gerrymandering can really be dramatically lessened when you are using larger districts that are harder to gerrymander in a way that disadvantages one party over the other. So that's been my experience as a voting rights attorney. And while as I said before, I want to stress caution. You need to look at local conditions, look at local voting patterns, make sure you have the population available to effectively have a voice under an alternative system. But I have seen that when those things are present, the use of alternative election methods that allow minority groups to have a voice in the process can be really very beneficial. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I will try to answer in some fashion questions if they arise in the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Gary. And this has been a terrific start to what I think is going to be a very important event. And I I look forward to hearing about how this all goes, because we're really at an important time with ranked choice voting. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, not getting into some of the election administration issues that are so important, but really talking about how it's gotten to this point as we get into American politics. I'm the executive director of FairVote. We've been working on these issues as both an advocate, but as a researcher for 25 years, and believe that there's good reasons why we're having this ranked choice voting conversation that Casey and Anita have started so well today. So just as a reminder, ranked choice voting is actually not a new idea. It's recommended in Robert's Rules of Order and other parliamentary guides. It's used in literally thousands of non-governmental organizations and schools. And we'll hit 100 years of use in Australia for its national elections shortly, and used in other major elections in countries like Malta, Australia, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland. They used it in London for their mayoral races and so on. In the United States, we're going to see it used statewide in Maine in June for contested, crowded primaries for governor on both the Democratic and Republican side. 15 cities now use ranked choice voting. Biggest ones are, I would say, are San Francisco, Minneapolis, Santa Fe just used it. There's others like St. Paul and Portland, Maine. And there were laws introduced in more than 20 states in the last year and a half or so in state legislatures. Two ones that passed this year that caught our eye in particular were in Oregon, where the legislature has appropriated the funds necessary for Benton County to start using ranked choice voting in its 2020 elections, and in Utah, where a bill passed almost unanimously to allow cities to use ranked choice voting starting in 2019, and we're expecting to see some cities take advantage of that. It's also used by overseas voters in a number of states, and some interesting party uses in their internal elections like Virginia and Iowa, Republican Party of Utah. There's a ballot, so you can sort of see what a voter is supposed to do. Of course, there's different designs, but that's the basic design that we think works well. What you do as a voter is use that ballot to express your rankings, and you don't have to rank more than one in the way that we use it in the United States, but people almost always do. And one of the reasons that they choose to do that is that it's not a point system. It's not one where voting for more than one person means your second choice counts against your first choice. Those are backup rankings, and I'll explain why that's important. So you start by just counting all the first choices, and in this example, you've got 3 candidates, and none of them have a majority of the vote. If you had a majority winner, you'd be done, just like any other election, but if not, you continue the count. And in this case, candidate C is in last place, and you look at each one of the people who the ballots cast for candidate C, and you reallocate them based on who was ranked next. And then you have what's known as an instant runoff, where you get down to 2 candidates, and it's really a head-to-head comparison at this point. So even though you started with more than 2 candidates and no majority winner, you're doing this essential runoff without asking the voters to come back to do it. That's basically the idea, and turns out voters like it, and it has a lot of applications that are making sense. The most obvious one is that when you have a runoff election, a traditional runoff election, you do get a majority in the second round, but it comes at some price. Quite literally, it costs a lot of money, both to the jurisdictions that have to pay for it, but also to the candidates having to run another election. And you, of course, situations for each individual voter where they have to do a little more than they did before. I think runoffs have virtues. I'm not saying that they're terrible things, but at the same time, we do see patterns that I think make ranked choice voting an attractive alternative. And it's one that several cities have acted on. So most of the uses that we see out there in the United States have been for places that had 2 rounds elections, folding them into one single election. Most of them nonpartisan elections. So they had a winnowing election or a first round where you could win them with a majority, but then a second round. And one thing is the voter turnout is almost is very different. If you look at all the primary runoffs that are done in a number of southern states for US Senate and US House, of the last 190 regularly scheduled such runoff elections, 183 had declines in turnout with the average almost 40%. If you look at ranked choice voting, of course, there's not a change in the turnout, but there is a change in the number of votes that are still counting for active candidates. But if you look at the averages of votes counting in the final instant runoff compared to the first round, it's more like 10%, 15%. Even in with the new ballot designs, like in Santa Fe, it was only 4% decline, compared to that average decline in runoffs of 39%. The cost of runoffs can be high, $20 million in New York City, which is debating ranked choice voting quite seriously to replace its citywide runoffs, $6 million in Georgia, and so on. You also can see some real tactical considerations, and as people might be following politics this year in California, where they have a top 2 primary system, which is essentially a runoff system for all its big offices, there's lots of talk of sort of tactics and split votes and candidates not getting to the final who are representative and so on. And you really get away from all of that with ranked choice voting if you can make it work. Then, of course, these states like Maine didn't have runoff elections, and because they didn't have runoff elections, they were getting winners who were often getting far less than half the votes. In fact, 9 of their last 11 elections for governor, the winning candidate got less than 50%. Each of the last 3 governors won one of their governor's races with less than 40%. And that triggered a whole conversation about ranked choice voting that led to the ballot measure success in 2016. You see this particularly in primary elections. Again, those following this year's cycle will know that there's a lot of upcoming primary elections that are drawing attention for crowded fields and potential controversial outcomes with candidates getting less than 50%. And while some of the southern states have runoffs, most don't. It's just a plurality, top of the heap result, and there can be real concerns that it's not a representative one. Back in 2016, when you had a presidential field on the Republican side with a lot of candidates, you actually didn't get a majority win in a primary until very late in the season and toward the end of April. All the other ones before that won with less than 50, and Democrats can expect that looking forward to 2020 with a likely big field. So one thing you start seeing with a ranked choice voting election is because of that dynamic of being able to indicate a ranking for more than one candidate, the candidates have to think about voters differently, and the voters get to think about their candidates differently. And that relationship tends to lead toward overall a more civil politics. Rutgers polls survey of 7 cities with ranked choice voting and a number without it back in 2013, 2014 found just that voters experienced it as a more civil election. That doesn't mean you won't see some negative campaigning, but you'll see less of it, and you'll certainly see incentives for a politics based on substance. And we've seen that really play out, I think, particularly well when everyone kind of gets a common playbook on how best to win with ranked choice voting, which is something that we and our allies have been trying to do in states and cities using this. There are more far-reaching ways that ranked choice voting is entering the conversation. Louisiana, as some people may know, doesn't even have primaries. They just go straight to the general election and have a contingent runoff if no one gets a majority. You could do that system and then use ranked choice voting instead of a runoff. We'll perhaps see some states having that conversation. Those controversies in top 2 primary systems where you have crowded primary fields are triggering interest in sort of a compromise solution of advancing more than 2 candidates, let's say 4 candidates would go to the November ballot from a primary like in California, and then you do ranked choice voting to handle having 4 candidates in November. So one particular use I just wanted to highlight because it's such a sensible, practical one, and it's really seemingly working well, is 5 southern states with runoff elections this year will be sending to their overseas voters a ranked choice ballot, not a vote for one ballot, or they actually send both. A vote for one ballot that'll count in the first round, then a ranked choice ballot to be examined in the event of a runoff, and they don't need to get that second ballot out to the voters because the voters can return it the first time. And you're seeing very high rates of voters in that system using it, having their ballot count in the runoff. Actually, a higher percentage of those in the data that we've been able to find counts in the runoff than actually the in-person voters. And it allows the states to hold their primaries closer together, which has been found to boost turnout overall for people, and has that win-win of empowering both the overseas voter and the in-person voter. that's been something that principle of having people who are voting early use a ranked choice ballot has drawn some interest in other uses. You can do it for cities, which actually often have even a narrower time frame between rounds of voting. Sometimes you'll see it as little as 1 or 2 weeks, and of course an overseas voter can't do that. New York City, with its big citywide primaries, it's only 3 weeks. When the one time I saw this put to voters liked the idea. They voted 91% to have Springfield, Illinois go to this system for their city elections. Another potential use that we think makes a lot of sense is in presidential elections, when you have those big fields and then you have the Iowa caucuses, New Hampshire primary, and candidates start dropping out, all the overseas voters got the ballots with those candidates' names on them. So when you start getting to contests a few weeks after New Hampshire and Iowa, voters are returning ballots for candidates who are no longer in the race. And if you just allowed them to cast a ranked choice ballot, it could count for the top candidate that's still in the race. So there are some questions with election administration and legal questions. You heard Casey get into some of those issues about how it's working in Minneapolis. But I think the encouraging thing from our perspective is that the big vendors and the small ones seem to be getting ready to run ranked choice voting elections with a push of a button. And that's taken a little time. It's slowed down, I think, the progress of the expansion of ranked choice voting in the US, but we're at a point where I think we're going to see it expand to a lot more places. And you also, of course, want to do voter education. I think sometimes the emphasis for jurisdictions going to RCV is to make sure voters know how to rank. It turns out that that's pretty straightforward, and good ballot designs and good instructions, which we're getting more and more evidence of how to do with groups like the Center for Civic Design, make that straightforward. You just want to make sure voters know why to rank and not be sort of thinking it's somehow tactically smart to rank the same candidate 3 times or something like that. And so I think that's for us the perhaps most important voter education requirement. There are some legal questions that have come up. Remarkably, ranked choice voting does have some people that haven't supported it. They often turn to the courts, and they've been, all those court challenges are almost all losing. There's not a single jurisdiction that's passed ranked choice voting in the last 20 years that has been blocked by a legal challenge from being able to use it for key elections. We have staff and pro bono lawyers who are helping to keep after these issues, and I think any legal issues that are out there will perhaps best addressed be in the crafting of the ballot measure or the language of the statute to make sure that it's consistent with state and local law. And there are no federal issues. So some people wonder about voter turnout. Casey talked about voter turnout for Minneapolis, and that's part of a pattern that we're certainly seeing, that as voters grow into using RCV, the turnout is generally going up for the big elections. And a big comprehensive study addressed one study that said it goes down, and a more comprehensive one said, no, it doesn't seem to be going down, doesn't tend to go up either. And that was done before these more recent elections, which seem to suggest it actually is going up. I think Anita's presentation about the sort of broader uses of ranked choice voting as a voting rights remedy points to the fact that the evidence that's out there is that actually ranked choice voting is good for all voters, including racial minorities. The one time the Department of Justice had to take a look at it in a voting rights review, they actually denied pre-clearance to a jurisdiction trying to change away from ranked choice voting, which is a high bar to show that voters were handling it well. Ranked choice voting has really been proven in a lot of elections. There are some other proposals that people raise. We don't want to discourage conversation about those, but I think those should be closely scrutinized for how they seem to actually work. They can be tried out in college and NGO elections and so on, which ranked choice voting has again, thousands of examples of. But the ones that are most often talked to us seem to have the track record that ranked choice voting does. It also, there's sort of some math-based concerns, but I think ranked choice voting really clearly is a step up from current systems or runoff elections and plurality elections on those respects. And there's no evidence that tactical voting has ever actually had an impact as like one group of voters getting an edge over others. And I think that's a really important sign of success. So there's a lot of good resources out there. We're at fairvote.org. Of course, the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center is a wonderful resource, rankedchoicevoting.org. We also have a website that we are building out, rankit.vote, with an app where you can actually design your own ranked choice voting contest, try it out, put it on your website, and that'll be getting better and better. So look forward to your questions. And if you want to be in touch, there's my email and phone number. And look forward to the rest of the seminar.
My name is Karen Brinson Bell. I'm actually one of the consultants with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. And my thank yous to Chris Hughes for starting us off today. And we will try to work through our technical difficulties as we do our other sessions for the symposium. Right now, we want to move to questions and answers with Casey, Carl, and Richie. They are live to answer your questions. So if you do have questions, please type those into the question field or the question option of your control panel for our attendees. And any questions that you might have for Anita will be sent to her via email, and we will publish her answers along with the answers that we get from Rob and Casey today in a question and answer document that we'll be releasing in about 2 weeks or so, that will be accompanied by a recording of this presentation. And we will try to repost Anita's recording in case that doesn't come through. And Rob, we might schedule a time to record your presentation once again if we find that that audio did not come through on the recording. So with that, Casey, you actually received our first question. Can you hear me now, Casey?
I hear you.
Great. What perception going into your RCV elections was negated most by the actual use?
Well, it's a personal opinion, but I think the survey data that we've done after each election would confirm this, and that is initially there was claims that RCV was too complicated, voters could not possibly wrap their minds around it, it was a complicated system. We did very extensive outreach, engagement, and education initiatives, both the city on its own and in partnership with other groups like FairVote Minnesota and some other community stakeholder groups. And I think the results have shown over those 3 cycles that each time it becomes more familiar, voters become better used to the presentation, not only the presentation on the ballot, but how to correctly mark their ballot. And the survey results from those that we've done show that not only do they understand it and have better familiarity, but the more we do it, the more they like it.
Thank you. That certainly helps. I know there's a lot of questions that surround how things will go leading into an election, but you certainly have addressed how things happen once it's in place. There actually is another question for you, Casey. How would you recommend advocates discuss ranked choice voting with their local board of elections or elections commission?
So I've been asked to do a lot of what I'll call dog and pony local jurisdictions since we were first out of the gate as the city to do ranked choice voting in the state. I always approach that by saying I'm agnostic in terms of whether RCV is good or bad. I'm an election administrator. My job is to do the will of the people. The people in Minneapolis said they wanted to do ranked choice voting. We're going to do it, and we're going to be the best at it. So that's been the motivation behind my process in administering our elections here. But when I do talk about elections, I point out, first past the post and ranked choice voting are only 2 forms or methods of voting. There are many, many forms. And at root, each one of those forms of voting are about values. They're expressions of values of the community. And one of the places that I feel that maybe the messaging is difficult when I come into a room is that people will say that advocates for ranked choice voting say that ranked choice voting guarantees a majority winner. And yet it hasn't done so in Minneapolis. How can you explain that? And so that puts me in a weird box because, of course, it hasn't produced an absolute majority winner. What it has produced is a consensus winner, a consensus of the majority. And I try and balance that language by saying, you're right, from pure mathematics, there wasn't a majority winner. But there isn't a majority winner in first past the post elections either. There's almost never a pure majority when you have more than 2 options. In fact, you can't guarantee a majority outcome if you have more than 2 people in a race. So to Mr. Richie's point, you get it down to 2 and you're going to have a majority in that competition. But I think the key, what I would say is ranked choice voting produces a consensus winner for the majority of the community. And that's the line that I use that seems to then allow both advocates and opponents to sort of get rid of that argument about majority outcome.
And let me add on that, Karen, because I think that's
Certainly.
a great point, Casey. And I think that part of the challenge of the discussion has been, it's often in a debate over replacing a runoff election where there seems to be a majority winner, right? When you reduce the field to 2, and of course, if there's only 2 people, one person, when they have more votes, has a majority.
Yep.
Are we having sound problems? I'm sorry if we are.
You're back now. You're back now.
Okay. I'm sorry about whatever our internet is doing here. Anyway, I was just trying to say that it's in this sort of contrast to a majority runoff system that in that sort of that instant runoff metaphor does produce a runoff the same way that a majority in the same way a traditional runoff does, and actually usually with higher numbers of votes than a traditional runoff. However, it's not necessarily a majority of the first round. So I think there is a rationale for why that word gets used, but I also believe that the word consensus is a very sensible one to use. With an additional point, just to add to it, just factually, is that the second place winner in the final instant runoff, the backers of that candidate have actually often ranked the winner as the second and third choice, and we never get to see that, but that's sort of part of what happened in the election, where the person to be successful was trying to figure out ways to connect with as many voters as possible.
I think y'all hit on what the person was asking, but they have sent a clarifying question, so I'll just put that out there so you can jump in on this if you have a slightly different answer. He says he meant to ask, how should someone discuss RCV with a board of elections in order to help them prepare for RCV elections in the future? Casey, do you have anything to add to what you were saying?
From a policy perspective, if you're discussing it with the Board of Elections, I think, again, I would focus, it depends. If the board is focused on a policy perspective, I'd focus on those values and what the values-based discussion is for the change. If it's from a practical, hands-on administrator's perspective, I think, again, the key thing is about process, and that the process is not complicated. It does require a change in how that process is handled, but those things are easily overcome, and especially as we move towards a tipping point where the vendor community gets on board and that becomes an automated solution, and it doesn't have to be quite so complex, at least in terms of a presentation.
Rob, do you have anything to add?
No, I think well, here, I guess just in general is to not be Pollyannish, to not be sort of skating past the realities that the election officials do have to make this work. And I think, I mean, Casey, maybe I don't know if this is a fair way to say it, but I think that a well-run election is taken for granted. One that doesn't go well, they sort of look at why the election officials didn't do it right. So it's sort of like a situation where just to introduce something new is something that might lead things to go wrong. So I think you just need to be very attentive to the fact that to try to make this as straightforward as possible, and to recognize that they're going to ask a lot of good, seemingly skeptical questions, but ones that are based on wanting to make sure it can all go well.
Adding to that, I would only, building off that point, yes, what we've done here with our council is prior to an election, several months out, we talk about plans and preparations for the election. As we get closer, we talk about our public engagement and education strategies. We talk about the technical aspects. We talk about election judge or poll worker recruitment strategies. So we really, really engage our policymakers through formal public reports, and through those formal public reports, of course, the media are covering us. Our meetings are broadcast, so the public has access to what we're saying. I think more communication, more frequently, very open and honest about if there are challenges, what are they, and what are you doing to address them? Keep comfort levels for policymakers, candidates, campaign workers, and voters more in control, so you're managing expectations before you even get to election day.
I think those are Words of wisdom for sure, Casey. Rob, the next question, and I think this will be our final question so that we don't keep folks over our hour. I will also just note that this question deals with San Francisco, and we do have Chris Jordanek from the San Francisco Commission joining us in the next session of the symposium. But you touched on San Francisco as being notable. What is noticeable, or what is notable in San Francisco for RCV?
Well, I guess it's a major city, so I think it's notable in the sense that just highlighting out of the 15 cities that are have been using or about to use ranked choice voting, it's I believe the biggest. It's very diverse, so there's a lot of people whose language at home might not be English. There's just a lot of racial and ethnic diversity, and they've had a lot of use of it. In fact, it's been every November. From 2004 all the way through 2016, there was at least one ranked choice voting election. So we've had a chance to see it play out over time. And right now, there's a major RCV election for mayor going on in June. You'll hear from Chris about some of the specific issues with San Francisco, but it has had the limitations of a ballot that wasn't necessarily the best ballot design. I think I wanted to maybe just make a general point is sometimes we evaluate a use of ranked choice voting as if that's sort of symptomatic of all ways to use ranked choice voting. But in fact, a lot of the places that have used it to date have had limitations on, say, the number of rankings. San Francisco and Minneapolis so far have only been allowing 3, and a certain way of listing the candidates that might not be the best ballot design. Anyway, San Francisco is about to be making some changes there, probably as soon as 2019, where voters can rank more candidates in a different ballot design. So I guess it's notable in the sense that it's just this major significant use where we can learn both from things that have gone well, things that could go better, and changes that they're making to try to help it go the right direction.
Great. Well, that's going to be the last question we get to today, but we do have some follow-up questions for both of you and for Anita. So if you will help us with those over the next couple of weeks, we'll get all the questions answered and out to our attendees via our website and email. And we do greatly thank you, Casey and Rob, for joining us today. And we certainly thank our attendees, and we appreciate your patience in dealing with our audio. We'll take the break to try to get those sorted out. So we do thank you for joining session 1 of the RCV Symposium. We will work with our panelists, as I mentioned, to provide answers to any questions we could not get to during this session. This document will be posted along with our recording in the coming weeks on our website, which is www.rankedchoicevoting.org. We hope you'll join us at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time for our next session, which is RCV Successes, a look at actual implementation. Until then, I'm Karen Brinson-Bell, and on behalf of the Ranked Choice Voting team, I hope you have a great rest of the morning, and we look forward to having you back with us. Thank you.